Greetings, this is James Gilliland with World Puja. We've got another fascinating show here. We've got Neil Kramer. And Neil is an English writer, speaker, and philosopher in the fields of consciousness, metaphysics, shamanism, and ancient mystical disciplines. Neil has spent over 20 years on a path of inner transformation and shares his discoveries and knowledge in writings, interviews, and lectures, as well as giving one-to-one teachings. He is a frequent guest on other popular alternative radio shows and internet shows, enjoying international audiences and enthusiastic support. His work is regularly published on cutting-edge websites, news portals, and popular media networks. His acclaimed website, The Cleaver, and his audiobook, The Audio Cleaver, attract large, discerning audiences. Neil gives interviews, teachings, and live presentations on many fascinating subjects, including path to authentic being, sovereign empowerment, transcending systems of control, and dimensional shifting. I like that one. So anyway, without any further ado, we'll bring Neil on the show. Neil, are you with us?
Yes, I am, James. It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, glad you're on the show. We're all kind of recovering here from extensive chemtrails, so bear with us a little bit.
Oh, goodness.
Anyway, there's so many things I would love to cover here. I know you have so many different. You sound a lot like me. You have your hands in so many different pots. But I'd like to discuss explore the inner work that you do and the role of emotions in raising frequency and consciousness.
Yes, indeed, yeah. Well, I think the inner work is really something that's quite foundational for anybody who's begun on their own path of conscious evolution and expansion and so on. And it's really a very much an alchemical aspect in that there are lots and lots of different perspectives to it. As you said, we have our fingers in many pies and we look at lots of different phenomena, lots of different disciplines and topics and so on. And one aspect of that, which I've been studying and working through and writing about for my forthcoming book, is the emotional aspect of that. And we all know that emotions have a very profound influence in shaping our lives, and to some degree they have a greater power and a deeper penetration than what we might say the abstractions of the intellect. And the emotions have this uncanny ability also to discern the truth of a thing. And for this reason, emotions being really very, very prescient and very unavoidable and very powerful, they do form a foundation for conscious growth. And so they're an intrinsic part of the inner work, essentially. That is the conscious work we do in ourselves. And the interest to me is that emotions seem to be inherently multidimensional in nature, in that they don't strictly function within the perceived boundaries of the intimate world of our own psyche and the barrier of the apparent external world outside. They seem to have this ability to reach out and touch things in a way that the intellect and the kind of machinations of one's brain can't do. And for this reason, I have found that on my personal inner work, and that is really, what I'm sharing, that it is of a massive benefit and, in fact, of great significance to acquaint ourselves with the dynamics of emotions, what they are, what they're for, what are they important, should we squash them, should we proclaim them, should we change them, etc. And to do this, we have to go to the felt experience of their origin, which, of course, lies initially inside us or within us. And so that the practice of this discipline, this sacred discipline, obviously a lot of New Age writers and a lot of self-help individuals will, write so fluently about, and, some fantastic books on that. But actually it stretches back to form part of a very, very core internal discipline, which is why I choose to term it the inner work. And what I've found basically is that integrating this emotional intelligence into one's daily life can really be kind of likened to the best way to do it is to put it against the technique of eating without gaining weight, and that is you do it little and often. So in that sense, feasts of emotion, as with food, can have a kind of fleeting short-term gain, but they're followed by more enduring, long-term issues, basically. And famines have similarly negative effects. So to become cognizant of one's own emotional patterns and appetites and achieving a corresponding harmonious balance is really, really fundamental to moving towards a more authentic and fulfilling way of life. And in so doing, then, of course, we create a deeper consciousness. And a lot of people, I find, particularly people looking at alternative issues, whether that's to do with consciousness or to do with conspiracy or to do with extraterrestrials or whatever, are very happy to sift through lots of information and seek physical experiences and seek evidence and so on and so forth. And I'm sure you come across this, of course, in your work.
Yes, we do.
But it can be very daunting for those self-same people to plumb the depths of their own psyche, to take a light to the shadows of their old patterns, their motivations, their traumas, and their dependencies and so on, because it brings you to your wiring, your hard wiring of your conditioning from your parents and your school and your workplace, etc. And really, that wiring that we have, those routines that we run, has been in place for an awful long time. So whether you begin to look at this for the first time at 20 or 40 or 60, it doesn't really matter. It's a long time. And so we kind of forget what it is and where it is and what it does. So for that reason, many people, with the best of intents, nevertheless, kind of interminably delay or defer this activity for as long as humanly possible. Mm-hmm. And, human beings have established, cunning techniques to suspend this inner work for indefinite periods, because the perceived shock, if you like, of looking deep within oneself at the truth of your life path and the truth of what you want to achieve and what you want to experience is quite a difficult thing to do. And people say, well, why would I bother to do this inner work? Why would I take the time to concern myself with refining my emotional intelligence and so on? And the answer is a simple one. The answer is that there is a direct correlation between the amount of inner work you do and the wholeness and joy of your life path. And the more inner work we do, quite simply, the better life is. And in this sense, we could say that wholeness can be kind of equated with an equilibrium of emotion and of intellect and of spirit. So when we're at our most balanced and when we're at our most kind of delicate and powerful state, there is, as I say, there is an equilibrium of these different things. So the inner work really is one of balance. And in the old kind of English Druidic traditions, this was very much recognized, and the Druids kind of were relatively unique, certainly in the land that I sprang from, in that a lot of their knowledge and teaching and gnosis was not written down. And it was not written down on purpose to an extent, because a lot of the transmission of their wisdom was really founded in experiential practice. That is, you cannot sit in an armchair and just read a book about it. You actually have to integrate it into your own life. And when you do that, then you begin to really participate in reality as a creator. And you understand that it is not so much a scene, a piece of scenery or a set like in a movie that you find yourself in, but it's more of a process. It's more of a phenomena of unfoldment rather than a thing. And emotional life is a key aspect of this, and you don't hear an awful lot about that, certainly in the sort of metaphysical side of the world that we work in. So that is a key thing for me, and we can see the importance of this thing, because if we examine what an emotion is, I would say that emotions show the movement of spirit. And if we for a moment, let us just model this thing so we can kind of get a little visual representation in our heads at least. If we say that the mind is the thing that we have most intimacy with in our own lives, so we have the mind that originates apparently from our brain, and it governs everything we do, who we are, what we see, what we experience, what we feel. It connects us to our bodies, to our organs, to our experiences, and so on. But the mind, as we know, is not necessarily an epiphenomenal from the brain. It doesn't really spring from that. And I think that anybody who has studied this, and certainly who is familiar with some of the older spiritual traditions and mystical practices, it becomes obvious that the further you probe into this, the consciousness is more of a field phenomena. And I always say that it's received and transmitted through the brain, it does not arise from it. So we kind of modulate it and we orchestrate it and we channel it basically. So I know you yourself have a channel experience, and a lot of people, find that quite controversial, but I would suggest that we kind of all do it all the time. The only difference is that when we channel in our day-to-day life, it is within very much a consensus construct. So we channel media, we channel, daily routine conversations, we channel the weather, we channel, music and so on. And because there's large agreement on those things, it isn't seen as particularly supernatural or mystical. It is just normal communication. But actually that consciousness is part of, as I say, this buzzword at the moment, I guess, the field. And so mind is really the interface for me between our physical, biological vessel, our bodies, and spirit. And spirit, in that sense, we could say is the part of us which really, you could say, never leaves the field. It never leaves this higher dimensional space. It is always present in many dimensions simultaneously. And so everybody's spirit, or if you prefer, you can swap that with higher self or whatever terminology feels best with you, exists, yes, in the 3D, which is for all intents and purposes real. We all have to deal with it. But it also stretches into higher dimensional spaces, fourth and fifth dimensional spaces. And a lot of the time when I speak to people about this, particularly face-to-face and in conferences and so on, it's instructive to note that when we say dimensions, it's quite a commonly used word nowadays. In the olden occult traditions, again, particularly of Britain and Europe, they used to call that the planes, the etheric planes. And that the word dimensions wasn't really in use at that time, certainly not in occult literature. And dimensions, in my understanding of it, is a slightly more neutral word, because if you say etheric planes to people, a lot of people are going to switch off or struggle with that. Similarly, if you go back to even older texts, Gnostic texts and pre-Christian texts, they will talk of the heavens, and there are like 7 levels of heavens. But really, as you put your mind across these things, you can sense in a broad way what we're talking about here is dimensions. So the spirit really is able to straddle all those things at the same time. So it exists in a higher dimensional space, and it connects us right now, as we listen, as we talk, to what we're doing, to our bodies. And we can say that probably quite a lot of listeners are familiar with the idea of quantum entanglement, whereby 2 quanta that have had entanglement at any point retain that relationship. And you can measure the spin of those 2 different things to determine that they're connected. And whether they're 1 inch apart or millions of miles apart, that is instantaneous communication. And that's interesting because it breaks down the apparently classical kind of Newtonian Cartesian physics that says nothing can go faster than light, which is evidently not so at the quantum level. And similarly, spirit kind of cuts through the usual space-time restrictions in this way. So we could say from a metaphysical angle that spirit exists in this higher dimension, So once we model that, we don't have to accept it or believe it or disbelieve it. Let us just hypothesize and model that for a moment. That is why spirit can see our whole life path. It can see the moment of birth and the moment of transition and everything in between. So as you understand this and bring it into the daily experience of your life, you see that so-called ESP and extrasensory phenomena of all different kinds make more sense in that way, because what you're doing is you are allowing mind to merge with spirit in a more fluid way. And if spirit has complete access to your life sphere, it appears to us who are restrained in the timeline, the temporal 3D plane, that it can see into the future, or it can see previous to our own birth. If you're in spirit, or if you're a higher dimensional entity, that is no big deal. That's just the way it is. So we could say this: the interface between spirit and brain is mind. And mind is very much to do with potential and to do with imagination. And it's what I call our kind of holographic imaginal palette. And when we purify that and discipline it and exercise it just like any other kind of muscle in a way, we begin to understand that we can directly shape and modify, and in some cases completely rewrite our reality. And we can go into these elements later on, I guess, but for now, let us say that for mind to operate smoothly and in equilibrium with spirit and brain, we have to kind of charge it, and we charge it through, to an extent, clearing the room of all the debris and all the objects and giving it a space to breathe and a space to accumulate this kind of psychic charge. And in the classical way, one technique for that, of course, is to meditate, is to clear mind, is to become present, and in so doing, just slow down all the other chatter and so on. And even in that very simple experience of a 5 or 25-minute meditation, spirit is able, higher self is able to move into mind. And when we do that, we open up the reality structure in a much more profound way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have an old saying here that we're multidimensional beings existing on a vibrational continuum. And, if you want to run around just thinking you're a body and a personality, that's fine. But, why limit yourself to that? And
well, that's right.
Yeah, clear out all those old wounds and traumas, in your mental and emotional body. Your access to spirit is going to be so thin that, you really have to get back to some kind of process-oriented therapy or something else, or like you're saying, meditation, to move through those old wounds and traumas, before you can have any kind of clear access to that higher consciousness and energy.
It is, certainly. The way I see it is that spirit, the good news is that spirit, higher self, etc., is always there. It's always present. Our signal, if you like, our connection to it, just kind of like an internet connection, if it's very thin, very low bandwidth, and it's always dropping out and there's a lot of static, it feels like one is separate from the world. Mm. And the things that create static are kind of like filters we put in place, like self and ego and brain and even personality to some extent. And the more those things dominate in mind, the more separate we feel, and events in our lives appear random, and the narratives in our lives appear chaotic, and all the people and objects and events and stuff just kind of bubble up from a seemingly decoherent set of phenomena. And it's when we think like that, and if we were to be really fundamentalist, materialist science about it, if you take that to its logical conclusion, then the universe really is just this big, cold, empty realm that has no real interest or, emotional connection to humans, to Homo sapiens. It doesn't really matter. We might as well just flicker in and out of existence without being noticed. And if you completely detach yourself from your higher dimensional self, then that is your reality. And for those who choose not to determine their own participation in reality, they are effectively disowning their own creative potential, their own responsibilities, and renouncing this inner work. So what I try and do in my writings and speaking and so on and teaching is give people kind of some level of understanding of this. And once people really get an inner feeling for it, it is a universal thing. It's not localized in certain special individuals. It's there in everybody. The only thing that certain people have is an ability to remove these synthetic filters much more kind of speedily than others. And once you do that, you can perceive it in people who do that a mile off. You can feel it when you look at them before they even open the mouth. You can see that this particular individual, whether they're articulate and eloquent or whether they're none of those things and they just literally walk into the room, you can feel it because spirit resonates with spirit. And that is why some people feel so positive, so affirmative, and this critical thing of bliss and of joy is what naturally transpires when we achieve that balance. And that is a universal communication medium for everybody. Everybody wants a bliss and serenity in their life. And it arises through balance. It is not, as you know, many people probably are already aware, it's not a pursuit in itself to seek that thing. It is a byproduct of function to some extent. When you are walking your dharma, when you are on your path on a day-to-day basis, no matter what your circumstances are, everybody is capable of that, then this serenity and this joy naturally surfaces, and a lot of the obstacles in life begin to just dissolve a little bit more freely and supportively, and we find that we can, you know, connect with things at a kind of deeper level. And everything that we do, our homes, our relationships, our intelligence, our passions, and so on, become charged with this, and this psychic element, and using that in just the classical term of psyche as of mind, not as anything, you know, particularly mystical. That psychic charge means that we are capable of achieving so much more. So the punchline, if you like, to all this kind of this dialogue of mine is that when you do it, life just gets better. And if you are focusing your energies on some of the more interesting phenomena in life, like the mystical experiences, the extraterrestrial contacts, and so on, you have to do this inner work for that to take place. And as I've heard you say, James, it is our responsibility to raise our consciousness if we do seek particularly contact. Mm-hmm. It's not their responsibility to kind of come to our level, because we have to be clear and we have to be balanced to accept that kind of phenomena in our life. Otherwise, it could kind of tip us over the edge. So it's kind of like a safeguard threshold, really, I guess, from their perspective.
It does. I've noticed that, you know, I've seen people out in the field here say, you know, come down, I'm ready, I want to get on the ship, you know, and they're out there just saying, you know, and then I saw this one ship drop down and it powered up and lit up the whole sky above us, and that woman ran and grabbed a tree and was just totally freaking out, you know, and I said, I don't think you're ready yet. You haven't mastered your fear yet, and a few other things. And I know some of these beings, their frequencies are so high. I mean, they've dropped the base emotions. They don't have the jealousy, the ownership, or greed, or separation. These programs are running. And when I first had my contact, you know, they told me that. They said that, you know, you have a lot of work to do, you know, before you come and really hang out with us. But, you know, we'll help you, inspire you along the way, and help point you in the right direction and things of that nature. But we're not going to do everything for you. And I see so many people out there thinking that, you know, that these beings are all here to just, you know, come and save them and pull them out of their own self-created realities, and you know, and they're their soulmate, you know, and they're going to be happy when this ET lands and steps off the ship and says, "Hi, honey, you know, come to the Pleiades with me." You know, I hear that all the time, and I know you probably run into this one. I find fascinating too, is that there's this, well, you know, it's I'm trying to think of a name for it, but it's kind of like that spiritual look, you know, on people's face. You know, it's kind of a spiritual smugness, and you know, I am spiritual. I am so enlightened. You know, I do my yoga every morning. I eat my goji beans and meditate, and you know, I'm superior. Yes. It's kind of a superior stance. It's really interesting, and they have all the words, they say all the right thing, but I love what you're saying. They're not authentic. They're not. No. They haven't dealt with their stuff yet.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, this inner work is a lifelong process. It doesn't suddenly click one day and you have this kind of Zen Kensho experience and then that's it. Mm-hmm. It's a lifelong unfoldment, really. And as I said earlier, that people are very cunning, and I do this too. Everybody does it to some extent in displacing the inner work, and people displace it with quick fixes like food and shopping and going out and watching movies and sports and so on, but also more sort of socially acceptable fixes like careers and devoting yourself to other people and religious devotion and cultural immersion. All those things displace the inner work, because anything that demands massive mental energy, whether it's mental or sensory, effectively kind of relegates the potential of you doing the inner work into just background noise because you're too damn busy, basically. So people will delay this thing until they get the new job, or until they've moved, or until they've lost 30 pounds, or until the kids leave home. And, to some extent, I've studied this as well, that people also use dysfunction to defer the inner work. So they'll even maintain an element of dysfunction in their life to drown out the need to do the inner work. So as well as on the positive side, I meditate for 6 hours a day, and like you say, eat my goji berries and all the rest of it. Those are good things in themselves.
Oh yeah.
But they're neutral. But when they constitute the sort of total focus of somebody's energies, that's when problems start to arise. So on the flip side of that, people also do the negative polarization, which is, as I say, which is dysfunction. So they will maintain, albeit subconsciously, they will maintain something like a bad relationship or a bad environment, or they will magnetize ill fortune or even illness to themselves. And when that dysfunction is in place, all the kind of resentment and pain that accumulates from years of this disowned inner work can then be conveniently channeled into the object of dysfunction, the bitch, the bastard, the job, the pointlessness, the illness, etc. And then again, they still continue not to be able to do it. So this denial is, unfortunately, is sort of quite endemic in society. So there has to be an acceptance that the inner work does involve looking within, and it's worth it, because when you do it, not only does life begin to take on what we all want, really, which isn't just authenticity, which isn't just fulfillment, but is magic, is the exhilaration of life, which I've spoken about once or twice before. And that's what everybody wants. And I'm sure you see that in people's eyes when they visit the ECETI Ranch. That's what people are looking for. They're looking for that inspiration in this magical encounter. And all we need to do, really, is a very simple thing. We need to acknowledge that the universe really compels us to encounter growth. And all the subsequent emotional upheavals and all the rewiring that we have to do to clean the plate, basically, to get to do this work, the closer we move our consciousness to the point of transition, to the point of change and the point of acceptance of change, the better. So we have to do this for ourselves. No one else can do it for us. And whether you're a regular guy or a very, very conscious guy or a higher dimensional guy, everybody knows that the path that we walk is very much customized to our own individual lives, and all the subtle textures and dynamics are all perfectly aligned for ourselves. So you can certainly give somebody wisdom, and you can point to the moon, to use the old expression, and say, this is one way to do it, this is something worth looking at. And there are sacred practices that can, really hugely assist the individual with calming the mind, stilling ego, putting psychological wiring just for a moment, just to suspend it while we get there. So there are those things there, but very much we have to understand that really the path leads to us only doing it ourselves. So we have to go very much to the core of what we are, to sharpen our thinking, yes, but also to acclimatize ourselves, to use one word for it, to our own spirituality. And again, if anyone has a problem with that, they probably don't on your show, but you could think of it as metaphysics or rewiring or self-help or whatever. And when we do that, we directly address all the source of the change and the any emotional turbulence that arises from that, and everything begins to align. So this is very much a process of alignment. And as this occurs, in the same way that the barrier between mind and spirit begins to blur in a very pleasing and agreeable way, so the barrier between the inner experience of the world and the apparent out there experience of the world begins to dissolve a little bit. And we understand, as we mentioned previously about the quantum level of things, that really there's no distinction between what is inside our head and what is outside it. And so spirit represents that in the most pure and graceful way possible. And once we begin to walk that path, after those first few difficult steps, going inside, each step gets bigger but easier. And once you get down that path, you know, some days you are literally gliding down it, and it's joyful, and it's brilliant, and it's wonderful. So there is no real thing to fear for this in any true sense of the word. It's very much an acceptance of oneself as a significant, important, sovereign being, to take yourself seriously as a powerful resource in this world, and to not only take yourself seriously, but also to have love for yourself. Because self really, although many Eastern traditions want to kind of squash that to some extent, is kind of your best friend really, because it's always there with you in all the stuff that you do. Self is always there, so you may as well make friends with it and have some kind of harmony with it, and not let it dominate, but also not try and conflict with it and battle with it all the time. You know, it's there as an ally really. And I think once that tonality is established, then we can enjoy being human beings, and we can enjoy playing our guitars and making wonderful dinners and, you know, making love with our beautiful, intimate partners and all the rest of it. All those things are there for a reason, there for an experience here while we're here. It doesn't mean we have to ignore that. It means we can, you know, to some degree, and this is a little bit of a cliche, but celebrate that physicality whilst we integrate that with the higher work.
I'm glad you said that, because I've been hammered so many times for making those same statements. And, you know, I always ask, you know, a lot of the yogis, you know, they die. And I said, why do they die? Because the body's nothing to them. And they say that this body's nothing. It means nothing to me. You know, this physical world is all Maya. It's all illusion. It's all, and so they remove their energy from it, and yes, it dies. And so I always felt, well, why not bring heaven to earth? Why not bring this higher conscious energy into the physical, you know, and align everything in perfect alignment and ascend versus, you know, letting the body go to dust as they are often focusing on it as just dust. And so I always felt that was a little glitch in the system that so many of us just would never look at.
It is. I think it's very important to understand that this is, you don't just want to move and phase out of the 3D to 4 and 5D spaces, because you can't do that until you achieve a certain level of integration from the enfolded dimensional space, if we can, again, use that terminology. So in other words, as we acquaint ourselves with trans-dimensional experiences, i.e. things that don't necessarily conform to the 3D laws of physics and of expectation, as we begin to bring those into our lives, then we, to an extent, begin to, and this is a loaded word, but we begin to purify our mind, and we begin to discipline our ability to move into higher dimensional spaces. Because if you don't do that, and if you gain great insight and great power and the ability to see forthcoming events and the ability to reconfigure matter, move through walls and all those wonderful, exciting things, if you're not clear in yourself and if you're not psychologically balanced, then you're going to create disastrous circumstances. So there seems to be a kind of universal law that you have to go through the training exercise of the 3D world, the physical world, before you can get to that. So if you think about it as zoomed out and as objectively as possible, there is no greater training ground for that than here, because here, in time, in the temporal zone, we get to see the consequences of our thoughts, and we get to see the karmic reactions of the things that we do. So being in a body for 70, 80, 90 years, if you're lucky, you get to contemplate the consequences of your actions, how you interact with other people, what you do, how you spend your time, basically. So at any point in your life, you can just step back for a moment, just get off the train for a minute and look at it, and just contemplate, how are you spending your time? What are you putting your energy into? And that is always a very ready, easy to hand measure of the kind of alignment that you've got. Because if you are not aligned, then you won't be happy, you won't be fulfilled, and you probably won't be doing the things that you want to do. As you begin to align yourself, as you begin to integrate mind more fluidly with spirit, which again is a perfectly organic, natural thing, then those experiences start to shift positively, and life tends to throw you these kind of brilliant synchronistic advantages and signposts, and they come in little small forms, like meeting somebody or having a conversation or bumping into someone on the train or whatever, but they also have significant, more phenomenal forms like visions, like mystical encounters, and like contact. And when those things occur, they represent a turning point at that point in the alignment in your life, and your spiritual trajectory and your physical trajectory are balanced, and you stand in those moments when synchronicities occur centered, basically. So whenever you encounter a synchronicity, you are centered, you are stood within the center of your own circle of experience. And that is, again, a very good tool to understand that you are on the right path, you are on the right line, because the universe is incredibly supportive in this respect.
Mm-hmm. So is that like developing the observer, where you master that loving detachment? You can watch all these things and still enjoy them and love them and all these things around you, but you're still in that space of the observer and not thrown onto that endless roller coaster, of attachment, you might say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly that. That if you always see things from purely mind, purely self, then everything tends to be experienced, as you put it, as a roller coaster with ups and downs and highs and lows and things that advantage you and things that disadvantage you. If you step off that roller coaster, you can observe the experiences that come to you a little bit more impartially. To zoom out is the way I describe it. You change your zoom level, so it's not right under your nose as it is when you're driving the car, or you're writing a letter or something. You have to be present and focused to do that. But there are times when it's good to completely zoom out from this and to see things on a greater scale, to observe not only your own narrative, but the higher narratives, the overlapping narratives, the meta-narratives that Robert Anton Wilson used to describe. And you realize that there are archetypal movements of energy in your life as well. So as Jung identified certain archetypes, we see them in our lives in the shape of relationships and people and all the things that shape us, positive and negative. But as you bring spirit into your daily experience, and again, in a very organic way, whether you're brushing your teeth or whether you're meditating on a mountaintop, it should have the same fidelity, however profound or trifling these things may seem. As you bring spirit in, then a very interesting thing happens, which is you don't take things personally all the time. The things that come into your life, you can enjoy them, you can not like them, you can embrace them, you can move away from them, but you're not always taking it personally, which to someone who doesn't have spirit seems very strange. You say, well, how can I not take that personally because it's me here. Well, it is you here if you're just a biological machine. But if you accept that you're using your biological machine for an experience, it's kind of like a video game. You don't necessarily take it personally when your little video game avatar gets squashed by a monster or something. You just think, oh, heck, let's, start that level again and do things a different way. And in the same way, if a negative experience befalls you, as many observers have pointed out, it's usually an opportunity for growth wrapped up in a little crisis. And depending on your awareness will depend on the density or the severity of that crisis. So if your awareness is low, you're going to get smacked in the teeth by something quite, sizable. If your awareness is high, it will take on a more subtle flavor, like it may be a dissatisfaction or an apathy. And those things have the same effect, which is, again, an opportunity, when you zoom out, an opportunity to realign, to examine where you are on your trajectory and recalibrate, basically, which is an ongoing process. And the further you go with this, rather than these huge swings from being high and cool and balanced to being low and detached and fragmented, that smooths out and it becomes more a game of fine-tuning rather than radical kind of remodeling.
I know in a lot of your work you're talking about the Gnostic scriptures about the archons and how they relate to some ETs, and actually I'd love to talk about how they some of the pitfalls of when people are opening up, because I always tell people before you even meditate or do anything, it's so important to clear your space and maintain your self-authority. And I see so many people just jump into anything that comes, and these beings jump in and they flatter you and they give you powers and abilities and all these other things. But there's always a price, which is your own spirit connection or your own soul connection. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah. Well, Gnosticism is a fascinating subject in itself, and there are various writings and various tractates, as they call them, not least the Nag Hammadi library, which was this set of texts which were found in Egypt and so on in the 1940s. And there are other texts as well and other kind of writings that we can get hold of. And it's a very loose term, really. And as I said at a conference earlier this year, the Gnostics, really, to call someone a Gnostic derives, I understand, from a Roman slang term, which was to call someone a know-it-all. So there was an element of that in that the Gnostics didn't necessarily call themselves the Gnostics. And as the Gnostic scholar John Lash suggests, they called themselves the Telestai. So when we talk of Gnosticism, we're just using common terminology so we can all kind of get a handle on what's going on here. But there are other layers to that, but anyone who's interested will encounter that soon enough. But the Gnostics were really a sort of pre-Christian spiritual group who they're way ahead of any Christian stuff. And the Christian theologists would have it that they were kind of like an unusual offshoot or slightly pre-Christian group, and Christianity took some of their stuff and moved forward with it and stuff. And in my studies of the 3 or 4 classic texts, that is definitely not the case. The Gnostics were around for an awfully long time. And in fact, as Telestai, the group, they probably derive from even earlier traditions of Druidic traditions and really indigenous shamanic traditions that, depending on where you were, as religious hierarchy kind of dominated and colonialized those spaces, it became Zoroastrianism or Mithraism, Romanism, Catholicism, and so on. And so it's always very difficult if you're using purely historical texts or Wikipedia texts. You have to really kind of do your own esoteric research as well and balance the two, not jump to one or the other, but balance the two. But the key principle of Gnosticism was that the Gnostics, unlike the Christians, put forth the idea that the reality that we experience, this world we all live in here on Earth, was formed by an entity called the demiurge. And the demiurge was a godlike being, not the god, in inverted commas, but a godlike being. And his job, really, I say his, obviously he didn't necessarily have a penis, so it's a bit strange to put gender in it like that, but we'll say that for now. This being, the demiurge, his job really was to look after the formulation of the earth and keep the quantum probability of a tree being a tree and of a man being a man and an apple being an apple all in place. And like all things, this entity was a thought form of the infinite divine creator. And again, for those who would prefer non-spiritual or divine language, you could say something different, like he was a fractal template or a quantum algorithm or something. But there was definitely this yes, precisely, yeah. But whichever, we're talking about the same thing. That the demiurge emanation was given the primary task of manifesting what I would term the default reality construct, consensus reality, through which all of us initially arise as units of consciousness, and we get to this place in order to self-actualize, spiritualize, explore, articulate, create, transcend. So it is a very, very significant place to come. And finally, that we transcend the polarity of this 3D existence, this temporality, and return to source. Not that's it over with, but probably for the next part of the journey, and so on and so on. So to put it plainly, we go down into the world, we cultivate our spiritual awareness, we map the immediate creation, and then we go home. Now, despite its root neutrality, like all thought forms, the demiurge is subject to compromise, is subject to error. And certainly in the Nag Hammadi texts, in these series of kind of parchment tractates, these little things that range from 1 page to sort of 25 and 30 pages, all collected together, many of them agree on the fact that there was an error in the system. And some researchers suggest that this error was kind of like due to the formation of really an ego within the demiurge, within this secondary god. And when the demiurge developed an ego, a personification of himself, then he started to acquire many of the challenges and polarizations that anybody with an ego is subject to. So the whole superstructure of reality has an error in it. It's like a program. It's like the Matrix. It has a bug in it. And deep Gnostic study begins to reveal that that is actually part of the plan, that this place is kind of fundamentally flawed on purpose. So we're not criticizing the divine creator because presumably he's not going to make those kind of mistakes. He puts it in place for a reason. And what we end up with is a world that was conceived of by an entity that saw itself as separate, and it saw itself as the ultimate, basically. So here we are in this world, in an imperfect, flawed creation by what some Gnostics called an insane god, a blind god. And they used the word Samael, which is the blind, basically. So the demiurge is in error, and therefore what it creates, despite the splendor and all the beauty, is also prone to error. And that error is indicated through polarization. And that's why we get these huge yuga cycles, these cyclical manifestations of darkness and of goldenness and of bliss. And it could be argued that we are currently exiting one of the sort of seasonal shadow realms where spirit and flesh is kind of trying to survive, basically. And life is, as Buddha said, is a struggle. And that's what Buddha meant, I would say, when he observed without any judgment or without any personalization that life is suffering. He didn't mean it's rubbish or it's pain. He meant it is necessarily a struggle. And in observing this struggle, not only in our own lives, but on a higher philosophical and spiritual level, we begin to see a deeper context. And the deeper context is that the construct is synthetic, is fabricated. So the world that we exist in, the world that we see here, as we cultivate our spiritual awareness, as no doubt as soon as you get into the sort of permanent 4 and 5D realms, you become aware that the Earth construct is synthetic. And it uses real, as we might say, organic structures, but they're organized in a synthetic way. And this, of course, is what leads to conspiracy research and Illuminist groups and so on, who are also aware of this and use this to their advantage. And higher beings who have nevertheless chosen external technology rather than internal spiritual technology are also caught up in that paradigm. So we're not just dealing with men, we're dealing with things outside of that as well. I'm sure you have your thoughts on that. So that is why, as you quite rightly say, acknowledging source, as many abductees have attested to, and acknowledging the divinity within us is kind of like a pretty bulletproof way of protecting yourself from any external influence or manipulation, because nothing can touch that, basically. Nothing can touch that. And although you might be wiped out or you might go totally unharmed, nevertheless it remains that your divinity is intact, because that ultimately is what lower beings run from. And they're always on the run from it because they spring from, in the Gnostic paradigm, the demiurge, which is in error.
I've noticed that we've had a lot of encounters here with I always tell people not all ETs are friendly. There's some that are very, very self-serving. And so it's really good to know who's who in the universe and get that inner sensitivity going and that self-authority. And as you're saying, make your own connection with source or spirit and run it through that. And I just see so many people running amok and, getting cities. They get these abilities and these powers, but they don't realize where they're coming from, and they haven't used that discernment. And I see so many people flock to these people because they can demonstrate these cities and these powers. But, I feel, well, that's their lesson as well. They will go to that person for whatever experience they need. But at the same time, it's so important. I always tell people that we have that as one of the first premises, that learn how to heal unseen negative influences and maintain your own self-authority before you go jumping into other worlds and the other dimensions, because it's not always friendly out there.
That's right, and that's precisely the reason why kind of symbolic and ritual occultic practice you would draw a circle which would represent your sovereignty and your, divine connection and your protection, to say, I symbolize my sovereignty in this circle and nothing can penetrate that. You don't need to draw the circle if you understand the underlying mechanics of that, which is that you are sovereign. And in that sovereignty is your lineage, your divine lineage to the source. And again, that may be spiritual or scientific depending on your view, but it's probably neither. It's just something much more organic than that. What I would say is that, and a very interesting little perspective on this, there is an assumption that if somebody is massively technologically superior to you, that they have done the inner work. They are hugely initiated and adept at the inner work. Not so, not so. If, as we said earlier in this conversation, that we recognize that many units of consciousness, many people, many beings, many entities, if they find the inner work difficult, they will do everything at their disposal to delay it and defer it and hide it and squash it. And this goes for every being as well that isn't necessarily derived from Earth in contemporary times. So anybody who isn't doing the inner work is compelled to take part in negatively polarized activities that will suppress their own inner work. So if you come across a negative entity, to some extent, it is not doing its inner work. So the greatest power we have is in acknowledging source, is to understand that the work we do in ourselves, the spiritual, the emotional, the philosophical, using intuition, using reason, using more, subtle energies than that, the whole game, the whole jigsaw, the whole spectrum. As we do that, we begin to become more resilient to those kind of energies. So that's why it is certainly, for somebody like yourself, is a great responsibility. And I'm sure from what you've just said and knowing a little bit of the background of your work, that it falls on people who do teach, like yourself and me, to instruct people that there is a reason why some people don't have profound experiences. And it's a very simple one, and it's not one to be taken personally. You're just not ready for it. You have to clean house to get contact with that experience. And sometimes it's a good thing. It's like a universal survival mechanism. If you're not being catapulted into the Pleiadian mothership, there's a reason for that. And it either means that you've got work to do still, or it means that there's a wiring job inside you that, until that is done, makes you vulnerable. So if you're going to, particularly on a transdimensional level, if we posit the whole idea that these aren't necessarily just hugely advanced physical beings with nice machines, but they are operating transdimensionally, which makes massive sense to me and has to be to some extent, then as you shift dimensional space, you are going to be very, very obvious and very, very, seeable and observable, like you've got a traffic cone on your head. If you suddenly shift space to a 4 or 5D space with a load of issues. So doing the inner work here is doing the discipline, is training in the kind of, spiritual kung fu, really, before you move to deeper realms.
Yeah, it'd be like throwing a wild monkey on the ship. It's like, they're big. Oh my God, what do we do with this? Send it back.
That's right.
Give it a banana and send it back.
Yeah, I mean, it's very important to balance, not just saying do all the hard work and then the fun begins. You can have the fun while you're doing the hard work, but it's scaled proportionately to where you're at. So if you've had the life path, the fortunate or synchronous life path, to begin from a spiritual angle, which is gladly, I'm grateful that that's where I came from, to study Zen, to study Kabbalah, to study Druidism, to study shamanism, and then later come to some of the negative aspects and as I say, some of the negative illuminist and extraterrestrial groups and so on. You can build that into the world picture much more readily, and you don't get sucked down into this dark unveiling all the time. And as anyone is familiar with my work, that is definitely something to be cautious of. If you constantly just research the dark stuff, it has an effect on you and it starts to infect you.
Oh.
But you have to fit it into a much more sort of holistic, zoomed out worldview. So the spiritual work in that sense equips you for more profound work and readies you for more profound experiences. And that's where the juice is. That's where the excitement is.
That's what I always say. If you devote most of your time and energy, as you're saying, to your own awakening process and healing process, and really raise your frequencies up, it's so much more beneficial than to focus on the negative so much, thinking that your ego is going to think it's going to save you or prevent things from happening. But I do acknowledge, there are negative events out there. There are negative beings out there. I don't focus on them. I have enough to deal with on my plate without going looking for them. They come find me quite often, and then I have to deal with them. But I always say just don't go looking for it all the time. Focus more on raising your own frequencies and maintain your own self-authority and stand in your own power, and then it's just a much more fruitful path.
Absolutely. And any negative entities that are encountered, you can pretty much determine that they are also trapped in their own polarity, even though it may be fantastic and incredible compared to ours. They are still in polarity, so they still have not found alignment in their path. So they're not of any interest to us. Let us focus on ourselves, and then we resonate to us other aligned beings, which inherently, as in our terminology, would be positive beings.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. We've just got a minute left. If people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Well, I have a website, a blog, thecleaver.blogspot.com, which is basically a place where my essays and interviews are kind of archived. And it's 4 years of essays, interviews on subjects to do with conscious evolution, spirituality, metaphysics, and so on. There's also an audio book you can get from there, so if you want to listen to the essays rather than read them, that's cool. There's the audio cleaver. There's also a set of recordings called Transitional Alchemy, which is from a speaking tour that I did with a friend and colleague earlier this year in the States, which is linked to from the Cleaver. So everything, including personal contact details, if anyone wants to email me, is probably from there. And also neilkramer.com is about to come online soon. That will also link you for the present time to the Cleaver. So neilkramer.com is probably a nice, rememberable place to go.
Great. And before we close there, I want to apologize to any of the yogis out there that I did that process for almost 11 years and did eat goji berries, and it was a great process. But there's so much more than tying yourself into a pretzel. But anyway, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. It's been a great conversation. We'll have to do it again soon.
No, thank you, James. I've very much enjoyed it, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you and your listeners.
All right. Well, we're out of time, so we've got to sign off here. So this is James Gilliland with World Puja signing off. Have a great day.